The boy was not quite so fortunate. Tim's nose was swollen and painful. Grant suspected it was broken. His right shoulder was badly bruised and swollen, but his legs seemed to be all right. Both kids could walk, that was the important thing. Grant himself was all right, except for a claw abrasion down his right chest where the Tyrannosaur had kicked him. It burned with every breath, but it didn't seem to be serious, and it didn't limit his movement. He wondered if he had been knocked unconscious, because he had only dim recollections of events immediately preceding the moment he had sat up, groaning, in the woods, 10 yards from the land cruiser. At first his chest had been bleeding, so he had stuck leaves on the wound, and after a while it clotted. Then he had started walking around looking for Malcolm and the kids. Grant couldn't believe he was still alive, and as scattered images began to come back to him, he tried to make sense of them. The Tyrannosaur should have killed them all, easily. Why hadn't it? "I'm hungry," Lex said. "Me too," Grant said. "We've got to get ourselves back to civilization, and we've got to tell them about the ship." "We're the only ones who know?" Tim said. "Yes, we've got to get back and tell them." "Then let's walk down the road toward the hotel," Tim said, pointing down the hill. "That way we'll meet them when they come for us." Grant considered that, and he kept thinking about one thing, the dark shape that had crossed between the land cruisers even before the attack started. What animal had that been? He could think of only one possibility, the little Tyrannosaur. "I don't think so, Tim. The road has high fences on both sides," Grant said. "If one of the Tyrannosaurs is further down on the road, we'll be trapped." "Then should we wait here?" Tim said. "Yes," Grant said. "Let's just wait here until someone comes." "I'm hungry," Lex said. "I hope it won't be very long," Grant said. "I don't want to stay here," Lex said. Then, from the bottom of the hill, they heard the sound of a man coughing. "Stay here," Grant said. He ran forward to look down the hill. "Stay here," Tim said, and he ran forward after him. Lex followed her brother. "Don't leave me! Don't leave me here, you guys!" Grant clapped his hand over her mouth. She struggled to protest. He shook his head and pointed over the hill for her to look. At the bottom of the hill, Grant saw Ed Regis standing rigid, unmoving. The forest around them had become deadly silent. The steady background drone of cicadas and frogs had ceased abruptly. There was only the faint rustle of leaves and the whine of the wind. Lex started to speak, but Grant pulled her against the trunk of the nearest tree, ducking down among the heavy gnarled roots at the base. Tim came in right after them. Grant put his hands to his lips, signaling them to be quiet, and then he slowly looked around the tree. The road below was dark, and as the branches of the big trees moved in the wind, the moonlight filtering through made a dappled shifting pattern. Ed Regis was gone. It took Grant a moment to locate him. The publicist was pressed up against the trunk of a big tree, hugging it. Regis wasn't moving at all. The forest remained silent. Lex tugged impatiently at Grant's shirt. She wanted to know what was happening. Then from somewhere very near, they heard a soft snorting exhalation, hardly louder than the wind. Lex heard it too, because she stopped struggling. The sound floated toward them again, soft as a sigh. Grant thought it was almost like the breathing of a horse. Grant looked at Regis and saw the moving shadows cast by the moonlight on the trunk of the tree. And then Grant realized there was another shadow, superimposed on the others, but not moving. A strong, curved neck and a square head. The exhalation came again. Tim leaned forward cautiously to look. Lex did too. They heard a crack as a branch broke, and into the path stepped a Tyrannosaur. It was a juvenile, about 8 feet tall, and it moved with the clumsy gait of a young animal, almost like a puppy. The juvenile Tyrannosaur shuffled down the path, stopping with every step to sniff the air before moving on. It passed the tree where Regis was hiding and gave no indication that it had seen him. Grant saw Regis's body relax slightly. Regis turned his head, trying to watch the Tyrannosaur on the far side of the tree. The Tyrannosaur was now out of view down the road. Regis started to relax, releasing his grip on the tree. but the jungle remained silent. Regis remained close to the tree trunk for another half-minute. Then the sounds of the forest returned. The first tentative croak of a tree frog, the buzz of one cicada, and then the full chorus. Regis stepped away from the tree, shaking his shoulders, releasing the tension. He walked into the middle of the road, looking in the direction of the departed tyrannosaur. The attack came from the left. The juvenile roared as it swung its head forward, knocking Regis flat to the ground. He yelled and scrambled to his feet, but the tyrannosaur pounced, and it must have pinned him with its hind leg because suddenly Regis wasn't moving. He was sitting up in the path, shouting at the dinosaur and waving his hands at it as if he could scare it off. The young dinosaur seemed perplexed by the sounds and movement coming from its tiny prey. The juvenile bent its head over, sniffing curiously, and Regis pounded on the snout with his fists. "Get away! Back off! Go on, back off!" Regis was shouting at the top of his lungs, and the dinosaur backed away, allowing Regis to get to his feet. Regis was shouting, "Yeah, you heard me! Back off! Get away!" as he moved away from the dinosaur. The juvenile continued to stare curiously at the odd, noisy little animal before it, but when Regis had gone a few paces, it lunged and knocked him down again. "It's playing with him," Grant thought. "Hey!" Regis shouted as he fell. But the juvenile did not pursue him, allowing him to get to his feet. He jumped to his feet and continued backing away. "You stupid! Back! Back! You hurt me! Back!" he shouted like a lion tamer. The juvenile roared, but it did not attack, and Regis now edged toward the trees and high foliage to the right. In another few steps, he would be in hiding. "Back, you! Back!" Regis shouted. And then, at the last moment, the juvenile pounced and knocked Regis flat on his back. "Cut that out!" Regis yelled. And the juvenile ducked his head, and Regis began to scream. No words, just a high-pitched scream. The scream cut off abruptly, and when the juvenile lifted his head, Grant saw ragged flesh in his jaws. "Oh, no," Lex said softly. Beside her, Tim had turned away, suddenly nauseated. His night vision goggles slipped from his forehead and landed on the ground with a metallic clink. The juvenile's head snapped up, and it looked toward the top of the hill. Tim picked up his goggles as Grant grabbed both the children's hands and began to run. Control. In the night, the compies scurried along the side of the road. Harding's jeep followed a short distance behind. Ellie pointed farther up the road. "Is that a light?" "Could be," Harding said. "Looks almost like headlights." The radio suddenly hummed and crackled. They heard John Arnold say, "You there?" "Ah, there he is," Harding said, finally. He pressed the button. "Yes, John, we're here. We're near the river, following the compies. It's quite interesting." More crackling. Then, "Eat your car!" "What did he say?" Gennaro said. "Something about a car," Ellie said. At Grant's dig in Montana, Ellie was the one who operated the radio phone. After years of experience, she'd become skilled at picking up garbled transmissions. "I think he said he needs your car." Harding pressed the button. "John, are you there? We can't read you very well. John?" There was a flash of lightning, followed by a long sizzle of radio static. Then Arnold's tense voice. "Where are... Ooh! We're 1 mile north of the Hipsy paddock, near the river, following some compies." "No! Damn well! Get back here! Ow!" "Sounds like he's got a problem," Ellie said, frowning. There was no mistaking the tension in the voice. "Maybe we should go back." Harding shrugged. "John's frequently got a problem. You know how engineers are. They want everything to go by the book." He pressed the button on the radio. "John, say again, please." More crackling. More static. The loud crash of lightning. Then, "Muldoon! Need your car! Ow!" Gennaro frowned. "Is he saying Muldoon needs our car?" "That's what it sounded like," Ellie said. "Well, that doesn't make any sense," Harding said. "Other stuck. Muldoon wants car." I get it, Ellie said. The other cars are stuck on the road in the storm, and Muldoon wants to go get them. Harding shrugged. Why doesn't Muldoon take the other car? He pushed the radio button. John, tell Muldoon to take the other car. It's in the garage. The radio crackled. Listen, crazy bastards! Car! Harding pressed the radio button. I said it's in the garage, John. The car is in the garage. More static. Edry has... Sing... One. I'm afraid this isn't getting us anywhere, Harding said. All right, John, we're coming in now. He turned the radio off and turned the car around. I just wish I understood what the urgency is. Harding put the Jeep in gear, and they rumbled down the road in the darkness. It was another 10 minutes before they saw the welcoming lights of the Safari Lodge, and as Harding pulled to a stop in front of the visitor center, they saw Muldoon coming toward them. He was shouting and waving his arms. God damn it, Arnold, you son of a bitch! God damn it, get this park back on track! Now! Get my grandkids back here, now! John Hammond stood in the control room screaming and stamping his little feet. He had been carrying on this way for the last 2 minutes, while Henry Wu stood in the corner looking stunned. Well, Mr. Hammond, Arnold said, Muldoon's on his way out right now to do exactly that. Arnold turned away and lit another cigarette. Hammond was like every other management guy Arnold had ever seen. Whether it was Disney or the Navy, management guys always behaved the same. They never understood the technical issues, and they thought that screaming was the way to make things happen. And maybe it was, if you were shouting at your secretaries to get you a limousine. But screaming didn't make any difference at all to the problems that Arnold now faced. The computer didn't care if it was screamed at. The power network didn't care if it was screamed at. Technical systems were completely indifferent to all this explosive human emotion. If anything, screaming was counterproductive, because Arnold now faced the virtual certainty that Nedry wasn't coming back, which meant that Arnold himself had to go into the computer code and try to figure out what had gone wrong. It was going to be a painstaking job. He'd need to be calm and careful. Why don't you go downstairs to the cafeteria, Arnold said, and get a cup of coffee. We'll call you when we have more news. I don't want a Malcolm effect here, Hammond said. Don't worry about a Malcolm effect, Arnold said. Will you let me go to work? God damn you, Hammond said. I'll call you, sir, when I have news from Muldoon, Arnold said. He pushed buttons on his console and saw the familiar control screens change. Stroke Jurassic Park main module stroke. Stroke call libs. Include biostat.sys. Include sysrom.vst. Include net.sys. Include power.module. Stroke initialize. Arnold was no longer operating the computer. He had now gone behind the scenes to look at the code, the line-by-line instructions that told the computer how to behave. Arnold was unhappily aware that the complete Jurassic Park program contained more than 500,000 lines of code, most of it undocumented, without explanation. Wu came forward. What are you doing, John? Checking the code. By inspection? That'll take forever. Tell me, Arnold said. Tell me. The road. Muldoon took the curve very fast, the Jeep sliding on the mud. Sitting beside him, Gennaro clenched his fists. They were racing along the cliff road high above the river, now hidden below them in darkness. Muldoon accelerated forward. His face was tense. How much farther? Gennaro said. 2, maybe 3 miles. Ellie and Harding were back at the visitor center. Gennaro had offered to accompany Muldoon. The car swerved. It's been an hour, Muldoon said, an hour, with no word from the other cars. But they have radios, Gennaro said. We haven't been able to raise them, Muldoon said. Gennaro frowned. If I was sitting in a car for an hour in the rain, I'd sure try to use the radio to call for somebody. So would I, Muldoon said. Gennaro shook his head. Do you really think something could have happened to them? Chances are, Muldoon said, that they're perfectly fine, but I'll be happier when I finally see them. Should be any minute now. The road curved, then ran up a hill. At the base of the hill, Gennaro saw something white lying among the ferns by the side of the road. Hold it, Gennaro said, and Muldoon braked. Gennaro jumped out and ran forward in the headlights of the Jeep to see what it was. It looked like a piece of clothing, but there was... Gennaro stopped. Even from 6 feet away, he could see clearly what it was. He walked forward more slowly. Muldoon leaned out of the car and said, What is it? It's a leg, Gennaro said. The flesh of the leg was pale blue-white, terminating in a jagged, bloody stump where the knee had been. Below the calf he saw a white sock and a brown slip-on shoe. It was a kind of shoe Ed Regis had been wearing. By then Muldoon was out of the car, running past him to crouch over the leg. Jesus! He lifted the leg out of the foliage, raising it into the light of the headlamps, and blood from the stump gushed down over his hand. Gennaro was still 3 feet away. He quickly bent over, put his hands on his knees, squeezed his eyes shut, and breathed deeply, trying not to be sick. "Gennaro!" Muldoon's voice was sharp. "What? Move! You're blocking the light." Gennaro took a breath and moved. When he opened his eyes, he saw Muldoon peering critically at the stump. "Torn at the joint line," Muldoon said. "Didn't bite it, twisted and ripped it. Just ripped his leg off." Muldoon stood up, holding the severed leg upside down, so the remaining blood dripped onto the ferns. His bloody hands smudged the white sock as he gripped the ankle. Gennaro felt sick again. "No question what happened," Muldoon was saying. "The T-Rex got him." Muldoon looked up the hill, then back to Gennaro. "You all right? Can you go on?" "Yes," Gennaro said. "I can go on." Muldoon was walking back toward the jeep, carrying the leg. "I guess we better bring this along," he said. "Doesn't seem right to leave it here. Christ, it's going to make a mess of the car. See if there's anything in the back, will you? A tarp or newspaper?" Gennaro opened the back door and rummaged around in the space behind the rear seat. He felt grateful to think about something else for a moment. The problem of how to wrap the severed leg expanded to fill his mind, crowding out all other thoughts. He found a canvas bag with a tool kit, a wheel rim, a cardboard box, and 2 tarps, he said. They were neatly folded plastic. "Give me one," Muldoon said, still standing outside the car. Muldoon wrapped the leg and passed the now shapeless bundle to Gennaro. Holding it in his hand, Gennaro was surprised at how heavy it felt. "Just put it in the back," Muldoon said. "If there's a way to wedge it, so it doesn't roll around." "Okay." Gennaro put the bundle in the back, and Muldoon got behind the wheel. He accelerated, the wheels spinning in the mud, then digging in. The jeep rushed up the hill, and for a moment at the top, the headlights still pointed upward into the foliage, and then they swung down, and Gennaro could see the road before them. "Jesus," Muldoon said. Gennaro saw a single Land Cruiser lying on its side in the center of the road. He couldn't see the second Land Cruiser at all. "Where's the other car?" Muldoon looked around briefly, pointed to the left. "There!" The second Land Cruiser was 20 feet away, crumpled at the foot of a tree. "What's it doing there?" "The T-Rex threw it." "Threw it?" Gennaro said. Muldoon's face was grim. "Let's get this over with," he said, climbing out of the jeep. They hurried forward to the second Land Cruiser. Their flashlights swung back and forth in the night. As they came closer, Gennaro saw how battered the car was. He was careful to let Muldoon look inside first. "I wouldn't worry," Muldoon said. "It's very unlikely we'll find anyone." "No?" "No," he said. He explained that during his years in Africa, he had visited the scenes of a half-dozen animal attacks on humans in the bush. One leopard attack. The leopard had torn open a tent in the night and taken a 3-year-old child. Then one buffalo attack in Amboseli. 2 lion attacks. 1 croc attack in the north near Meru. In every case, there was surprisingly little evidence left behind. Inexperienced people imagined horrific proofs of an animal attack, torn limbs left behind in the tent, trails of dripping blood leading away into the bush, blood-stained clothing not far from the campsite. But the truth was, there was usually nothing at all, particularly if the victim was small, an infant or a young child. The person just seemed to disappear, as if he had walked out into the bush and never come back. A predator could kill a child just by shaking it, snapping the neck. Usually there wasn't any blood. And most of the time you never found any other remains of the victims, sometimes a button from a shirt or a sliver of rubber from a shoe, but most of the time, nothing. Predators took children, they preferred children, and they left nothing behind, though Muldoon thought it highly unlikely that they would ever find any remains of the children. But as he looked in now, he had a surprise. "I'll be damned," he said. Muldoon tried to put the scene together. The front windshield of the Land Cruiser was shattered, but there wasn't much glass nearby. He had noticed shards of glass back on the road, so the windshield must have been broken back there before the Tyrannosaur picked the car up and threw it here. But the car had taken a tremendous beating. Muldoon shone his light inside. "Empty?" Gennaro said tensely. "Not quite," Muldoon said. His flashlight glinted off a crushed radio handset, and on the floor of the car he saw something else, something curved and black. The front doors were dented and jammed shut, but he climbed in through the back door and crawled over the seat to pick up the black object. "It's a watch," he said, peering at it in the beam of his flashlight. A cheap digital watch with a molded black rubber strap. The LCD face was shattered. He thought the boy might have been wearing it, though he wasn't sure, but it was the kind of watch a kid would have. "What is it, a watch?" Gennaro said. "Yes, and there's a radio, but it's broken." "Is that significant?" "Yes, and there's something else." Muldoon sniffed. There was a sour odor inside the car. He shone the light around until he saw the vomit dripping off the side door panel. He touched it, still fresh. "One of the kids may still be alive," Muldoon said. Gennaro squinted at him. "What makes you think so?" "The watch," Muldoon said. "The watch proves it." He handed the watch to Gennaro, who held it in the glow of the flashlight and turned it over in his hands. "Crystal is cracked," Gennaro said. "That's right," Muldoon said. "And the band is uninjured." "Which means?" "The kid took it off." "That could have happened any time," Gennaro said. "Any time before the attack." "No," Muldoon said. "Those LCD crystals are tough. It takes a powerful blow to break them. The watch face was shattered during the attack." "So the kid took his watch off?" "Think about it," Muldoon said. "If you were being attacked by a tyrannosaur, would you stop to take your watch off?" "Maybe it was torn off." "It's almost impossible to tear a watch off somebody's wrist without tearing the hand off, too. Anyway, the band is intact." "No," Muldoon said. "The kid took it off himself. He looked at his watch, saw it was broken, and took it off. He had the time to do that." "When?" "It could only have been after the attack," Muldoon said. "The kid must have been in this car after the attack, and the radio was broken, so he left it behind, too. He's a bright kid, and he knew they weren't useful." "If he's so bright," Gennaro said, "where'd he go? Because I'd stay right here and wait to be picked up." "Yes," Muldoon said, "but perhaps he couldn't stay here. Maybe the Tyrannosaur came back, or some other animal. Anyway, something made him leave." "And where'd he go?" Gennaro said. "Let's see if we can determine that," Muldoon said, and he strode off toward the main road. Gennaro watched Muldoon peering at the ground with his flashlight. His face was just inches from the mud, intent on his search. Muldoon really believed he was on to something, that at least one of the kids was still alive. Gennaro remained unimpressed. The shock of finding the severed leg had left him with a grim determination to close the park and destroy it. No matter what Muldoon said, Gennaro suspected him of unwarranted enthusiasm and hopefulness and— "You notice these prints?" Muldoon asked, still looking at the ground. "What prints?" Gennaro said. "These footprints, see them? Coming toward us from up the road. And they're adult-size prints, some kind of rubber-soled shoe. Notice the distinctive tread pattern." Gennaro saw only mud, puddles catching the light from the flashlights. "You can see," Muldoon continued, "the adult prints come to here, where they're joined by other prints, small and medium-size, moving around in circles, overlapping, almost as if they're standing together talking. But now here they are, and they seem to be running." He pointed off. "There, into the park." Gennaro shook his head. "You can see whatever you want in this mud." Muldoon got to his feet and stepped back. He looked down at the ground and sighed. "Say what you like. I'll wager one of the kids survived, and maybe both. Perhaps even an adult as well, if these big prints belong to someone other than Regis. We've got to search the park." "Tonight?" Gennaro said. But Muldoon wasn't listening. He had walked away toward an embankment of soft earth near a drain pipe for rain. He crouched again. "What was that little girl wearing?" "Christ," Gennaro said, "I don't know." Proceeding slowly, Muldoon moved farther toward the side of the road, and then they heard a wheezing sound. It was definitely an animal sound. "Listen," Gennaro said, feeling panic. "I think we better—" "Shh," Muldoon said. He paused, listening. "It's just the wind," Gennaro said. They heard the wheezing again, distinctly this time. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from the foliage directly ahead of him, by the side of the road. It didn't sound like an animal, but Muldoon moved forward cautiously. He waggled his light and shouted, but the wheezing did not change character. Muldoon pushed aside the fronds of a palm. "What is it?" Gennaro said. "It's Malcolm," Muldoon said. Ian Malcolm lay on his back, his skin grey-white, mouth slackly open. His breath came in wheezing gasps. Muldoon handed the flashlight to Gennaro and then bent to examine the body. "I can't find the injury," he said. "Head okay, chest, arms." Then Gennaro shone the light on the legs. "He put a tourniquet on." Malcolm's belt was twisted tight over the right thigh. Gennaro moved the light down the leg. The right ankle was bent outward at an awkward angle from the leg, the trousers flattened, soaked in blood. Muldoon touched the ankle gently, and Malcolm groaned. Muldoon stepped back and tried to decide what to do next. Malcolm might have other injuries. His back might be broken. It might kill him to move him. But if they left him here, he would die of shock. It was only because he had had the presence of mind to put a tourniquet on that he hadn't already bled to death. And probably he was doomed. They might as well move him. Gennaro helped Muldoon pick the man up, hoisting him awkwardly over their shoulders. Malcolm moaned and breathed in ragged gasps. "Lex," he said. "Lex went... Lex." "Who's Lex?" Muldoon said. "The little girl," Gennaro said. They carried Malcolm back to the jeep and rested him into the back seat. Gennaro tightened the tourniquet around his leg. Malcolm groaned again. Muldoon slid the trouser cuff up and saw the pulpy flesh beneath, the dull white splinters of protruding bone. "We've got to get him back," Muldoon said. "You going to leave here without the kids?" Gennaro said. "If they went into the park, it's 20 square miles, Muldoon said, shaking his head. "The only way we can find anything out there is with the motion sensors. If the kids are alive and moving around, the motion sensors will pick them up, and we can go right to them and bring them back. But if we don't take Dr. Malcolm back right now, he'll die." "Then we have to go back," Gennaro said. "Yes, I think so." They climbed into the car. Gennaro said, "Are you going to tell Hammond the kids are missing?" "No," Muldoon said. "You are." Control. Donald Gennaro stared at Hammond, sitting in the deserted cafeteria. The man was spooning ice cream, calmly eating it. "So, Muldoon believes the children are somewhere in the park." "He thinks so, yes." "Then I'm sure we'll find them." "I hope so," Gennaro said. He watched the old man deliberately eating, and he felt a chill. "Oh, I am sure we'll find them. After all, I keep telling everyone this park is made for kids." Gennaro said, "Just so you understand that they're missing, sir." "Missing?" he snapped. "Of course I know they're missing. I'm not senile." He sighed and changed tone again. "Look, Donald," Hammond said, "let's not get carried away. We've had a little breakdown from the storm or whatever, and as a result we've suffered a regrettable, unfortunate accident. And that's all that's happened. We're dealing with it. Arnold will get the computers cleaned up, Muldoon will pick up the kids, and I have no doubt he'll be back with them by the time we finish this ice cream. So let's just wait and see what develops, shall we?" "Whatever you say, sir," Gennaro said. "Why?" Henry Wu said, looking at the console screen. "Because I think Nedry did something to the code," Arnold said. "That's why I'm checking it." "All right," Wu said, "but have you tried your options?" "Like what?" Arnold said. "I don't know. Aren't the safety systems still running?" Wu said. "Key checks, all that?" "Jesus," Arnold said, snapping his fingers. "They must be. Safety systems can't be turned off except at the main panel." "Well," Wu said, "if key checks is active, you can trace what he did." "I sure as hell can," Arnold said. He started to press buttons. Why hadn't he thought of it before? It was so obvious. The computer system at Jurassic Park had several tiers of safety systems built into it. One of them was a key check program, which monitored all the keystrokes entered by operators with access to the system. It was originally installed as a debugging device, but it was retained for its security value. In a moment, all the keystrokes that Nedry had entered into the computer earlier in the day were listed in a window on the screen. There was a string of numbers, followed by words, part words, and numerical instructions. System Nedry. Go to command level. Nedry. 040-hatchmark XY-67 ampersand. MR Goodbytes. Security. Keycheck off. Safety off. SL off. Security. white_rabbit.object. "That's it?" Arnold said. "He was screwing around here for hours, it seemed like." "Probably just killing time," Wu said, until he finally decided to get down to it. The initial list of numbers represented the ASCII keyboard codes for the keys Nedry had pushed at his console. Those numbers meant he was still within the standard user interface, like any ordinary user of the computer, So, initially, Nedry was just looking around, which you wouldn't have expected of the programmer who had designed the system. Maybe he was trying to see if there were changes before he went in, Wu said. Maybe, Arnold said. Arnold was now looking at the list of commands which allowed him to follow Nedry's progression through the system line by line. At least we can see what he did. System was Nedry's request to leave the ordinary user interface and access the code itself. The computer asked for his name, and he replied Nedry. That name was authorized to access the code, so the computer allowed him into the system. Nedry asked to go to command level, the computer's highest level of control. The command level required extra security and asked Nedry for his name, access number, and password. Nedry 040-#XY-67 MR Goodbytes. Those entries got Nedry into the command level. From there, he wanted security, and since he was authorized, the computer allowed him to go there. Once at the security level, Nedry tried 3 variations: keycheck off, safety off, SL off. He's trying to turn off the safety systems, Wu said. He doesn't want anybody to see what he's about to do. Exactly, Arnold said. And apparently he doesn't know it's no longer possible to turn the systems off except by manually flipping switches on the main board. After 3 failed commands, the computer automatically began to worry about Nedry. But since he had gotten in with proper authorization, the computer would assume that Nedry was lost, trying to do something he couldn't accomplish from where he was. So the computer asked him again where he wanted to be, and Nedry said security, and he was allowed to remain there. Finally, Wu said, here's the kicker. He pointed to the last of the commands Nedry had entered, white_rabbit.object. What the hell is that? Arnold said. White rabbit? Is that supposed to be his private joke? It's marked as an object, Wu said. In computer terminology, an object was a block of code that could be moved around and used the way you might move a chair in a room. An object might be a set of commands to draw a picture, or to refresh the screen, or to perform a certain calculation. Let's see where it is in the code, Arnold said. Maybe we can figure out what it does. He went to the program utilities and typed, find white_rabbit.object. The computer flashed back, object not found in libraries. It doesn't exist, Arnold said. Then search the code listing, Wu said. Arnold typed, find_listings, white_rabbit.object. The screen scrolled rapidly, the lines of code blurring as they swept past. It continued this way for almost a minute, and then abruptly stopped. There it is, Wu said. It's not an object, it's a command. The screen showed an arrow pointing to a single line of code buried amidst innocuous lines of instructions. Arrow on white_rabbit.object call link, parenthesis security perimeter, parenthesis set to off. Son of a bitch, Arnold said. Wu shook his head. It isn't a bug in the code at all. No, Arnold said, it's a trapdoor. The fat bastard put in what looked like an object call, but it's actually a command that links the security and perimeter systems and then turns them off. Gives him complete access to every place in the park. Then we must be able to turn them back on, Wu said. Yeah, we must. Arnold frowned at the screen. All we have to do is figure out the command. I'll run an execution trace on the link, he said. We'll see where that gets us. Wu got up from his chair. Meanwhile, he said, meanwhile, that somebody went into the freezer about an hour ago. I think I better go count my embryos. Ellie was in her room, about to change out of her wet clothes, when there was a knock on the door. Alan? She said. But when she opened the door, she saw Muldoon standing there, with a plastic-wrapped package under his arm. Muldoon was also soaking wet, and there were streaks of dirt on his clothes. I'm sorry, but we need your help, Muldoon said briskly. The land cruisers were attacked an hour ago. We brought Malcolm back, but he's in shock. He's got a very bad injury to his leg. He's still unconscious, but I put him in the bed in his room. Harding is on his way over. Harding? She said. What about the others? We haven't found the others yet, Dr. Sattler, Muldoon said. He was speaking slowly now. Oh, my God. But we think that Dr. Grant and the children are still alive. We think they went into the park, Dr. Sattler. Went into the park? We think so. Meanwhile, Malcolm needs help. I've called Harding. Shouldn't you call a doctor? There's no doctor on the island. Harding's the best we have. But surely you can call for a doctor, she said. No. Muldoon shook his head. Phone lines are down. We can't call out. He shifted the package in his arm. "What's that?" she said. "Nothing. Just go to Malcolm's room and help Harding, if you will." And Muldoon was gone. She sat on her bed, shocked. Ellie Sattler was not a woman disposed to unnecessary panic, and she had known Grant to get out of dangerous situations before. Once he'd been lost in the Badlands for 4 days, when a cliff gave way beneath him, and his truck fell 100 feet into a ravine. Grant's right leg was broken. He had no water, but he had walked back on a broken leg. On the other hand, the kids... She shook her head, pushing the thought away. The kids were probably with Grant, and if Grant was out in the park, well, what better person to get them safely through Jurassic Park than a dinosaur expert? In the park. "I'm tired," Lex said. "Carry me, Dr. Grant." "You're too big to carry," Tim said. "But I'm tired," she said. "Okay, Lex," Grant said, picking her up. "Oof, you're heavy." It was almost 9 p.m. The full moon was blurred by drifting mist, and their blunted shadows led them across an open field toward dark woods beyond. Grant was lost in thought, trying to decide where he was. Since they had originally crossed over the fence that the Tyrannosaur had battered down, Grant was reasonably sure they were now somewhere in the Tyrannosaur paddock, which was a place he did not want to be. In his mind, he kept seeing the computer tracing of the Tyrannosaur's home range, the tight squiggle of lines that traced his movements within a small area. He and the kids were in that area now. But Grant also remembered that the Tyrannosaurs were isolated from all the other animals, which meant that they would know they had left the paddock when they crossed the barrier, a fence or a moat or both. He had seen no barriers so far. The girl put her head on his shoulder and twirled her hair in her fingers. Soon she was snoring. Tim trudged alongside Grant. "Are you holding up, Tim?" "Okay," he said, "but I think we might be in the Tyrannosaur area." "I'm pretty sure we are. I hope we get out soon." "You going to go into the woods?" Tim said. As they came closer, the woods seemed dark and forbidding. "Yes," Grant said. "I think we can navigate by the numbers on the motion sensors." The motion sensors were green boxes set about 4 feet off the ground. Some were freestanding, most were attached to trees. None of them were working because apparently the power was still off. Each sensor box had a glass lens mounted in the center and a painted code number beneath that. Up ahead in the mist-streaked moonlight, Grant could see a box marked T/S/04. They entered the forest. Huge trees loomed on all sides. In the moonlight, a low mist clung to the ground, curling around the roots of the trees. It was beautiful, but it made walking treacherous. And Grant was watching the sensors. They seemed to be numbered in descending order. He passed T/S/03 and T/S/02. Eventually, they reached T/S/01. He was tired from carrying the girl, and he had hoped this would coincide with a boundary for the Tyrannosaur paddock, but it was just another box in the middle of the woods. The next box after that was marked T/N/01, followed by T/N/02. Grant realized the numbers must be arranged geographically around a central point like a compass. They were going from south to north, so the numbers got smaller as they approached the center, then got larger again. "At least we're going the right way," Tim said. "Good for you," Grant said. Tim smiled and stumbled over vines in the mist. He got quickly to his feet. They walked on for a while. "My parents are getting a divorce," he said. "Uh-huh," Grant said. "My dad moved out last month. He has his own place in Mill Valley now." "Uh-huh." "He never carries my sister anymore. He never even picks her up." "And he says you have dinosaurs on the brain," Grant said. Tim sighed. "Yeah." "You miss him?" Grant said. "Not really," Tim said. "Sometimes. She misses him more." "Who, your mother?" "No, Lex. My mom has a boyfriend. She knows him from work." They walked in silence for a while, passing T/N/03 and T/N/04. "Have you met him?" Grant said. "Yeah." "How is he?" "He's okay," Tim said. "He's younger than my dad, but he's bald." "How does he treat you?" "I don't know. Okay. I think he just tries to get on my good side. I don't know what's going to happen. Sometimes my mom says we'll have to sell the house and move. Sometimes he and my mom fight, late at night. I sit in my room and play with my computer, but I can still hear it." "Uh-huh," Grant said. "Are you divorced?" "No," Grant said. "My wife died a long time ago." "And now you're with Dr. Sattler?" Grant smiled in the darkness. "No, she's my student."
"You mean she's still in school?"
"Graduate school, yes." Grant paused long enough to shift Lex to his other shoulder, and then they continued on, past T-N-05 and T-N-06. There was the rumble of thunder in the distance. The storm had moved to the south. There was very little sound in the forest except for the drone of cicadas and the soft croaking of tree frogs.
"You have children?" Tim asked.
"No," Grant said.
"Are you going to marry Dr. Sattler?"
"No, she's marrying a nice doctor in Chicago sometime next year."
"Oh,"
Tim said. He seemed surprised to hear it. They walked along for a while.
"Then who are you going to marry?"
"I don't think I'm going to marry anybody," Grant said.
"Me neither,"
Tim said. They walked for a while. Tim said,
"Are we going to walk all night?"
"I don't think I can," Grant said. "We'll have to stop, at least for a few hours." He glanced at his watch. "We're okay. We've got almost 15 hours before we have to be back, before the ship reaches the mainland."
"Where are we going to stop?"
Tim asked immediately. Grant was wondering the same thing. His first thought was that they might climb a tree and sleep up there. But they would have to climb very high to get safely away from the animals, and Lex might fall out while she was asleep, and tree branches were hard. They wouldn't get any rest, at least he wouldn't. They needed someplace really safe. He thought back to the plans he had seen on the jet coming down. He remembered that there were outlying buildings for each of the different divisions. Grant didn't know what they were like because plans for the individual buildings weren't included, and he couldn't remember exactly where they were, but he remembered they were scattered all around the park. There might be buildings somewhere nearby. But that was a different requirement from simply crossing a barrier and getting out of the tyrannosaur paddock. Finding a building meant a search strategy of some kind, and the best strategies were... "Tim, can you hold your sister for me? I'm going to climb a tree and have a look around." High in the branches, he had a good view of the forest, the tops of the trees extending away to his left and right. They were surprisingly near the edge of the forest. Directly ahead, the trees ended before a clearing with an electrified fence and a pale concrete moat. Beyond that, a large open field, in what he assumed was the sauropod paddock. In the distance, more trees and misty moonlight sparkling on the ocean. Somewhere he heard the bellowing of a dinosaur, but it was far away. He put on Tim's night vision goggles and looked again. He followed the gray curve of the moat, and then saw what he was looking for, the dark strip of a service road leading to the flat rectangle of a roof. The roof was barely above ground level, but it was there, and it wasn't far, maybe a quarter of a mile or so from the tree. When he came back down, Lex was sniffling. "What's the matter?"
"I heard an aminal."
"It won't bother us. Are you awake now? Come on." He led her to the fence. It was 12 feet high, with a spiral of barbed wire at the top. It seemed to stretch far above them in the moonlight. The moat was immediately on the other side. Lex looked up at the fence doubtfully. "Can you climb it?" Grant asked her. She handed him her glove and her baseball.
"Sure. Easy."
He started to climb.
"But I bet Timmy can't."
Tim spun in fury. "You shut up!"
"Timmy's afraid of heights."
"I am not." She climbed higher.
"I so am not. Then come and get me."
Grant turned to Tim, pale in the darkness. The boy wasn't moving. "You okay with the fence, Tim?"
"Sure."
"Want some help?"
"Timmy's a fraidy cat,"
Lex called. "What a stupid jerk," Tim said, and he started to climb.
"It's freezing,"
Lex said. They were standing waist-deep in smelly water at the bottom of a deep concrete moat. They had climbed the fence without incident, except that Tim had torn his shirt on the coils of barbed wire at the top. Then they had all slid down into the moat, and now Grant was looking for a way out.
"At least I got Timmy over the fence for you," Lex said. "He really is scared most times." "Thanks for your help," Tim said sarcastically.
In the moonlight he could see floating lumps on the surface. He moved along the moat, looking at the concrete wall on the far side. The concrete was smooth. They couldn't possibly climb it.
"Ew,"
Lex said, pointing to the water. "It won't hurt you, Lex." Grant finally found a place where the concrete had cracked and a vine grew down toward the water. He tugged on the vine, and it held his weight. "Let's go, kids." They started to climb the vine back to the field above. It took only a few minutes to cross the field to the embankment leading to the below-grade service road and the maintenance building off to the right. They passed 2 motion sensors, and Grant noticed with some uneasiness that the sensors were still not working, nor were the lights. More than 2 hours had passed since the power first went out, and it was not yet restored. Somewhere in the distance they heard the tyrannosaur roar.
"Is he around here?" Lex said.
"No," Grant said. "We're in another section of park from him." They slid down a grassy embankment and moved toward the concrete building. In the darkness, it was forbidding, bunker-like.
"What is this place?"
Lex said. "It's safe," Grant said, hoping that was true. The entrance gate was large enough to drive a truck through. It was fitted with heavy bars. Inside they could see the building was an open shed with piles of grass and bales of hay stacked among equipment. The gate was locked with a heavy padlock. As Grant was examining it, Lex slipped sideways between the bars.
"Come on, you guys."
Tim followed her.
"I think you can do it, Dr. Grant."
He was right. It was a tight squeeze, but Grant was able to ease his body between the bars and get into the shed. As soon as he was inside, a wave of exhaustion struck him.
"I wonder if there's anything to eat,"
Lex said. "Just hay." Grant broke open a bale and spread it around on the concrete. The hay in the center was warm. They lay down, feeling the warmth. Lex curled up beside him and closed her eyes. Tim put his arm around her. He heard the sauropods trumpeting softly in the distance. Neither child spoke. They were almost immediately snoring. Grant raised his arm to look at his watch, but it was too dark to see. He felt the warmth of the children against his own body. Grant closed his eyes and slept. Control. Muldoon and Gennaro came into the control room just as Arnold clapped his hands and said, "Got you, you little son of a bitch!" "What is it?" Gennaro said. Arnold pointed to the screen where arrows pointed to 4 more lines of code. Arrow on Feeney.object link set security perimeter. Arrow on Feeney.object call link.sst security perimeter set to on. Arrow on Feeney.object set link.sst security perimeter restore. Arrow on Feeney.object delete line rf white_rabbit.object Feeney.object. "That's it," Arnold said, pleased. "That's what?" Gennaro asked, staring at the screen. "I finally found the command to restore the original code. The command called Feeney.object resets the linked parameters, namely the fence and the power." "Good," Muldoon said. "But it does something else," Arnold said. "It then erases the code lines that refer to it. It destroys all evidence it was ever there." "Pretty slick." Gennaro shook his head. "I don't know much about computers." Although he knew enough to know what it meant when a high-tech company went back to the source code, it meant big, big problems. "Well, watch this," Arnold said, and he typed in the command Feeney.object. The screen flickered and immediately changed. Muldoon pointed to the windows. "Look!" Outside, the big quartz lights were coming on throughout the park. They went to the windows and looked out. "Hot damn," Arnold said. Gennaro said, "Does this mean the electrified fences are back on?" "You bet it does," Arnold said. "It'll take a few seconds to get up to full power because we've got 50 miles of fence out there and the generator has to charge the capacitors along the way. But in half a minute, we'll be back in business." Arnold pointed to the vertical glass see-through map of the park. On the map, bright red lines were snaking out from the power station, moving throughout the park as electricity surged through the fences. "And the motion sensors?" Gennaro said. "Yes, them too. It'll be a few minutes while the computer counts. But everything's working," Arnold said. 9:30, and we've got the whole damn thing back up and running. Grant opened his eyes. Brilliant blue light was streaming into the building through the bars of the gate. Quartz light. The power was back on. Groggily, he looked at his watch. It was just 9:30. He'd been asleep only a couple of minutes. He decided he could sleep a few minutes more, and then he would go back up to the field and stand in front of the motion sensors and wave, setting them off. The control room would spot him. They'd send a car out to pick him and the kids up. He'd tell Arnold to recall the supply ship, and they'd all finish the night in their own beds back in the lodge. He would do that right away. In just a couple of minutes, he yawned and closed his eyes again. "Not bad," Arnold said in the control room, staring at the glowing map. "There's only 3 cutouts in the whole park. Much better than I hoped for." "Cutouts?" Gennaro said. "The fence automatically cuts out short-circuited sections," he explained. "You can see a big one here in Sector 12, near the main road." "That's where the wrecks knocked the fence down," Muldoon said. "Exactly. And another one is here in Sector 11, near the sauropod maintenance building." "Why would that section be out?" Gennaro said. God knows, Arnold said. Probably storm damage, or a fallen tree. We could check it on the monitor in a while. The third one is over there by the Jungle River. Don't know why that should be out either. As Gennaro looked, the map became more complex, filling with green spots and numbers. What's all this? The animals. The motion sensors are working again, and the computer's starting to identify the location of all the animals in the park, and anybody else, too. Gennaro stared at the map. You mean Grant and the kids? Yes. We've reset our search number above 400, so if they're out there moving around, Arnold said, the motion sensors will pick them up as additional animals. He stared at the map. But I don't see any additionals yet. Why does it take so long? Gennaro said. You have to realize, Mr. Gennaro, Arnold said, that there's a lot of extraneous movement out there. Branches blowing in the wind, birds flying around, all kinds of stuff. The computer has to eliminate all the background movement. It may take, Okay, count's finished. Gennaro said, You don't see the kids? Arnold twisted in his chair and looked back to the map. No, he said. At the moment, there are no additionals on the map at all. Everything out there has been accounted for as a dinosaur. They're probably up in a tree, or somewhere else where we can't see them. I wouldn't worry yet. Several animals haven't shown up, like the big Rex. That's probably because it's sleeping somewhere and not moving. The people may be sleeping too, we just don't know. Muldoon shook his head. We better get on with it, he said. We need to repair the fences and get the animals back into their paddocks. According to that computer, we got 5 to herd back to the proper paddocks. I'll take the maintenance crews out now. Arnold turned to Gennaro. You may want to see how Dr. Malcolm is doing. Tell Dr. Harding that Muldoon will need him in about an hour to supervise the herding, and I'll notify Mr. Hammond that we're starting our final cleanup. Gennaro passed through the iron gates and went in the front door of the safari lodge. He saw Ellie Sattler coming down the hallway, carrying towels and a pan of steaming water. There's a kitchen at the other end, she said. We're using that to boil water for the dressings. How is he? Gennaro asked. Surprisingly good, she said. Gennaro followed Ellie down to Malcolm's room and was startled to hear the sound of laughter. The mathematician lay on his back in the bed, with Harding adjusting an IV line. So the other man says, I'll tell you frankly, I didn't like it, Bill. I went back to toilet paper. Harding was laughing. It's not bad, is it? Malcolm said, smiling. Ah, Mr. Gennaro, you've come to see me. Now you know what happens from trying to get a leg up on the situation. Gennaro came in tentatively. Harding said, He's on fairly high doses of morphine. Not high enough, I can tell you, Malcolm said. Christ, he's stingy with his drugs. Did they find the others yet? No, not yet, Gennaro said, but I'm glad to see you doing so well. How else should I be doing, Malcolm said, with a compound fracture of the leg that is likely septic and beginning to smell rather, pungent? But I always say if you can't keep a sense of humor... Gennaro smiled. Do you remember what happened? Of course I remember, Malcolm said. Do you think you could be bitten by a Tyrannosaurus Rex and it would escape your mind? No, indeed, I'll tell you, you remember it for the rest of your life. In my case, perhaps not a terribly long time, but still, yes, I remember. Malcolm described running from the Land Cruiser in the rain and being chased down by the Rex. It was my own damn fault. He was too close, but I was panicked. In any case, he picked me up in his jaws. How? Gennaro said. Torso, Malcolm said and lifted his shirt. A broad semicircle of bruised punctures ran from his shoulder to his navel. Lifted me up in his jaws, shook me bloody hard, and threw me down. And I was fine. Terrified, of course, but still and all fine. Right up to the moment he threw me. I broke the leg in the fall, but the bite was not half bad. He sighed, considering. Harding said, Most of the big carnivores don't have strong jaws. The real power is in the neck musculature. The jaws just hold on while they use the neck to twist and rip. But with a small creature like Dr. Malcolm, the animal would just shake him and then toss him. I'm afraid that's right, Malcolm said. I doubt I'd have survived except the big chap's heart wasn't in it. To tell the truth, he struck me as a rather clumsy attacker of anything less than an automobile or a small apartment building. You think he attacked half-heartedly? It pains me to say it, Malcolm said, but I don't honestly feel I had his full attention. He had mine, of course, but then he weighs 8 tons. I don't. Gennaro turned to Harding and said, They're going to repair the fences now. Arnold says Muldoon will need your help herding animals. Okay, Harding said. "So long as you leave me Dr. Sattler and ample morphine," Malcolm said, "and so long as we do not have a Malcolm effect here." "What's a Malcolm effect?" Gennaro said. "Modesty forbids me," Malcolm said, "from telling you the details of the phenomenon named after me." He sighed again and closed his eyes. In a moment he was sleeping. Ellie walked out into the hallway with Gennaro. "Don't be fooled," she said. "It's a great strain on him. When will you have a helicopter here?" "A helicopter? He needs surgery on that leg. Make sure they send for a helicopter and get him off this island." The park. The portable generators sputtered and roared to life, and the quartz floodlights glowed at the ends of their telescoping arms. Muldoon heard the soft gurgle of the jungle river a few yards to the north. He turned back to the maintenance van and saw one of the workmen coming out with a big power saw. "No," he said, "just the ropes, Carlos. We don't need to cut it." They turned back to look at the fence. They had difficulty finding the shortened section at first because there wasn't much to see. A small protocarpus tree was leaning against the fence. It was one of several that had been planted in this region of the park, their feathery branches intended to conceal the fence from view. But this particular tree had been tied down with guy wires and turnbuckles. The wires had broken free in the storm, and the metal turnbuckles had blown against the fence and shorted it out. Of course, none of this should have happened. Grounds crews were supposed to use plastic-coated wires and ceramic turnbuckles near fences, but it had happened anyway. In any case, it wasn't going to be a big job. All they had to do was pull the tree off the fence, remove the metal fittings, and mark it for the gardeners to fix in the morning. It shouldn't take more than 20 minutes. And that was just as well, because Muldoon knew the Dilophosaurs always stayed close to the river. Even though the workmen were separated from the river by the fence, the Dillos could spit right through it, delivering their blinding poison. Ramon, one of the workmen, came over. "Senor Muldoon," he said, "did you see the lights?" "What lights?" Muldoon said. Ramon pointed to the east through the jungle. "I saw it as we were coming out. It is there, very faint. You see it? It looks like the lights of a car, but it is not moving." Muldoon squinted. It probably was just a maintenance light. After all, power was back on. "We'll worry about it later," he said. "Right now, let's just get that tree off the fence." Arnold was in an expansive mood. The park was almost back in order. Muldoon was repairing the fences. Hammond had gone off to supervise the transfer of the animals with Harding. Although he was tired, Arnold was feeling good. He was even in a mood to indulge the lawyer, Gennaro. "The Malcolm effect?" Arnold said. "You worried about that?" "I'm just curious," Gennaro said. "You mean you want me to tell you why Ian Malcolm is wrong?" "Sure." Arnold lit another cigarette. "It's technical." "Try me." "Okay," Arnold said. "Chaos theory describes nonlinear systems. It's now become a very broad theory that's been used to study everything from the stock market to heart rhythms. A very fashionable theory. Very trendy to apply it to any complex system where there might be unpredictability. Okay?" "Okay," Gennaro said. Ian Malcolm is a mathematician specializing in chaos theory. Quite amusing and personable, but basically what he does, besides wear black, is use computers to model the behavior of complex systems. And John Hammond loves the latest scientific fad, so he asked Malcolm to model the system at Jurassic Park, which Malcolm did. Malcolm's models are all face-space shapes on a computer screen. Have you seen them? "No," Gennaro said. "Well, they look like a weird, twisted ship's propeller. According to Malcolm, the behavior of any system follows the surface of the propeller. You with me?" "Not exactly," Gennaro said. Arnold held his hand in the air. "Let's say I put a drop of water on the back of my hand. That drop is going to run off my hand. Maybe it'll run toward my wrist. Maybe it'll run toward my thumb, or down between my fingers. I don't know for sure where it will go, but I know it will run somewhere along the surface of my hand. It has to." "Okay," Gennaro said. "Chaos theory treats the behavior of a whole system like a drop of water moving on a complicated propeller surface. The drop may spiral down or slip outward toward the edge. It may do many different things, depending, but it will always move along the surface of the propeller." "Okay." Malcolm's models tend to have a ledge or a sharp incline where the drop of water will speed up greatly. He modestly calls this speeding up movement the Malcolm effect. The whole system could suddenly collapse, and that was what he said about Jurassic Park, that it had inherent instability. Inherent instability, Gennaro said. And what did you do when you got his report? We disagreed with it and ignored it, of course, Arnold said. Was that wise? It's self-evident, Arnold said. We're dealing with living systems, after all. This is life, not computer models. In the harsh quartz lights, the hypsilophodont's green head hung down out of the sling, the tongue dangling, the eyes dull. "Careful! Careful!" Hammond shouted as the crane began to lift. Harding grunted and eased the head back onto the leather straps. He didn't want to impede circulation through the carotid artery. The crane hissed as it lifted the animal into the air onto the waiting flatbed truck. The Hypsy was a small dryosaur, 7 feet long, weighing about 500 pounds. She was dark green, with mottled brown spots. She was breathing slowly, but she seemed all right. Harding had shot her a few minutes before with a tranquilizer gun, and apparently he had guessed the correct dose. There was always a tense moment dosing these big animals. Too little, and they would run off into the forest, collapsing where you couldn't get to them. Too much, and they went into terminal cardiac arrest. This one had taken a single bounding leap and keeled over, perfectly dosed. "Watch it! Easy!" Hammond was shouting to the workmen. "Mr. Hammond," Harding said, "please." "Well, they should be careful." "They are being careful," Harding said. He climbed up onto the back of the flatbed as the Hypsy came down, and he set her into the restraining harness. Harding slipped on the cardiogram collar that monitored heartbeat, then picked up the big electronic thermometer the size of a turkey baster and slipped it into the rectum. It beeped, 96.2 degrees. "How is she?" Hammond asked fretfully. "She's fine," Harding said. "She's only dropped 1.5 degrees." "That's too much," Hammond said. "Too deep." "You don't want her waking up and jumping off the truck," Harding snapped. Before coming to the park, Harding had been the chief of veterinary medicine at the San Diego Zoo and the world's leading expert on avian care. He flew all over the world, consulting with zoos in Europe, India, and Japan on the care of exotic birds. He'd had no interest when this peculiar little man showed up, offering him a position in a private game park. But when he learned what Hammond had done, it was impossible to pass up. Harding had an academic bent, and the prospect of writing the first textbook of veterinary internal medicine, Diseases of Dinosauria, was compelling. In the late 20th century, veterinary medicine was scientifically advanced. The best zoos ran clinics little different from hospitals. New textbooks were merely refinements of old. For a world-class practitioner, there were no worlds left to conquer. But to be the first to care for a whole new class of animals, that was something. And Harding had never regretted his decision. He had developed considerable expertise with these animals, and he didn't want to hear from Hammond now. The Hypsy snorted and twitched. She was still breathing shallowly. There was no ocular reflex yet, but it was time to get moving. "All aboard!" Harding shouted. "Let's get this girl back to her paddock." "Living systems," Arnold said, "are not like mechanical systems. Living systems are never in equilibrium. They are inherently unstable. They may seem stable, but they're not. Everything is moving and changing. In a sense, everything is on the edge of collapse." Gennaro was frowning. "But lots of things don't change. Body temperature doesn't change, all kinds of other—" "Body temperature changes constantly," Arnold said. "Constantly. It changes cyclically over 24 hours, lowest in the morning, highest in the afternoon. It changes with mood, with disease, with exercise, with outside temperature, with food. It continuously fluctuates up and down, tiny jiggles on a graph, because at any moment some forces are pushing temperature up or other forces are pulling it down. It is inherently unstable, and every other aspect of living systems is like that too." "So you're saying Malcolm's just another theoretician," Arnold said. Sitting in his office, he made a nice mathematical model, and it never occurred to him that what he saw as defects were actually necessities. "Look, when I was working on missiles, we dealt with something called resonant yaw. Resonant yaw meant that even though a missile was only slightly unstable off the pad, it was hopeless. It was inevitably going to go out of control, and it couldn't be brought back. That's a feature of mechanical systems. A little wobble can get worse until the whole system collapses. But those same little wobbles are essential to a living system. They mean the system is healthy and responsive. Malcolm never understood that." "Are you sure he didn't understand that? He seems pretty clear on the difference between living and non-living." "Look," Arnold said, "the proof is right here." He pointed to the screens. "In less than an hour," he said, "the park will be all back online. The only thing I've got left to clear is the telephones. For some reason, they're still out, but everything else will be working. And that's not theoretical, that's a fact. The needle went deep into the neck, and Harding injected the medrine into the anesthetized female dryosaur as she lay on her side on the ground. Immediately, the animal began to recover, snorting and kicking her powerful hind legs. "Back, everybody," Harding said, scrambling away. "Get back!" The dinosaur staggered to her feet, standing drunkenly. She shook her lizard head, stared at the people standing back in the quartz lights, and blinked. "She's drooling," Hammond said, worried. "Temporary," Harding said. "It'll stop." The dryosaur coughed, and then moved slowly across the field, away from the lights. "Why isn't she hopping?" "She will," Harding said. "It'll take her about an hour to recover fully. She's fine." He turned back to the car. "Okay, boys, let's go deal with the stego." Muldoon watched as the last of the stakes was pounded into the ground. The lines were pulled taut, and the protocarpus tree was lifted clear. Muldoon could see the blackened, charred streaks on the silver fence where the short had occurred. At the base of the fence, several ceramic insulators had burst. They would have to be replaced. But before that could be done, Arnold would have to shut down all the fences. "Control, this is Muldoon. We're ready to begin repair." "All right," Arnold said. "Shutting out your section now." Muldoon glanced at his watch. Somewhere in the distance he heard soft hooting. It sounded like owls, but he knew it was the Dilophosaurs. He went over to Ramon and said, "Let's finish this up. I want to get to those other sections of fence." An hour went by. Donald Gennaro stared at the glowing map in the control room as the spots and numbers flickered and changed. "What's happening now?" Arnold worked at the console. "I'm trying to get the phones back so we can call about Malcolm." "No, I mean out there." Arnold glanced up at the board. "It looks as if they're about done with the animals and the two sections. Just as I told you, the park is back in hand, with no catastrophic Malcolm effect. In fact, there's just that third section of fence. Arnold!" It was Muldoon's voice. "Yes? Have you seen this bloody fence?" "Just a minute." On one of the monitors, Gennaro saw a high angle down on a field of grass blowing in the wind. In the distance was a low concrete roof. "That's the sauropod maintenance building," Arnold explained. "It's one of the utility structures we use for equipment, feed storage, and so on. We have them all around the park, in each of the paddocks." On the monitor, the video image panned. "We're turning the camera now to get a look at the fence." Gennaro saw a shining wall of metallic mesh in the light. One section had been trampled, knocked flat. Muldoon's jeep and work crew were there. "Huh," Arnold said. "Looks like the wrecks went into the sauropod paddock." Muldoon said, "Fine dining tonight." "We'll have to get him out of there," Arnold said. "With what?" Muldoon said. "We haven't got anything to use on a Rex. I'll fix this fence, but I'm not going in there until daylight." "Hammond won't like it. We'll discuss it when I get back," Muldoon said. "How many sauropods will the Rex kill?" Hammond said, pacing around the control room. "Probably just one," Harding said. "Sauropods are big. The Rex can feed off a single kill for several days." "We have to go out and get him tonight," Hammond said. Muldoon shook his head. "I'm not going in there until daylight." Hammond was rising up and down on the balls of his feet, the way he did whenever he was angry. "Are you forgetting you work for me?" "No, Mr. Hammond, I'm not forgetting. But that's a full-grown adult tyrannosaur out there. How do you plan to get him?" "We have tranquilizer guns." "We have tranquilizer guns that shoot a 20cc dart," Muldoon said. "Fine for an animal that weighs 400 or 500 pounds. That tyrannosaur weighs 8 tons. It wouldn't even feel it." "You ordered a larger weapon?" "I ordered 3 larger weapons, Mr. Hammond, but you cut the requisition, so we only got 1. And it's gone. Nedry took it when he left." "That was pretty stupid. Who let that happen?" "Nedry's not my problem, Mr. Hammond," Muldoon said. "You're saying," Hammond said, "that as of this moment, there is no way to stop the tyrannosaur?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Muldoon said. "That's ridiculous," Hammond said. "It's your park, Mr. Hammond. You didn't want anybody to be able to injure your precious dinosaurs. Well, now you've got a Rex in with the sauropods, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it." He left the room. "Just a minute," Hammond said, hurrying after him. Gennaro stared at the screens and listened to the shouted argument in the hallway outside. He said to Arnold, "I guess you don't have control of the park yet, after all." "Don't kid yourself," Arnold said, lighting another cigarette. "We have the park. It'll be dawn in a couple of hours. We may lose a couple of dinos before we get the Rex out of there, but believe me, we have the park." dawn. Grant was awakened by a loud grinding noise, followed by a mechanical clanking. He opened his eyes and saw a bale of hay rolling past him on a conveyor belt up toward the ceiling. 2 more bales followed it. Then the clanking stopped as abruptly as it had begun, and the concrete building was silent again. Grant yawned. He stretched sleepily, winced in pain, and sat up. Soft yellow light came through the side windows. It was morning. He had slept the whole night. He looked quickly at his watch. 5 a.m. Still almost 6 hours to go before the boat had to be recalled. He rolled onto his back, groaning. His head throbbed and his body ached as if he had been beaten up. From around the corner he heard a squeaking sound like a rusty wheel, and then Lex giggling. Grant stood slowly and looked at the building. Now that it was daylight, he could see it was some kind of maintenance building with sacks of hay and supplies. On the wall he saw a gray metal box and a stenciled sign, Sauropod Maintenance Building 04. This must be the sauropod paddock, as he had thought. He opened the box and saw a telephone, but when he lifted the receiver he heard only hissing static. Apparently the phones weren't working yet.
"Chew your food," Lex was saying. "Don't be a piggy, Ralph."
Grant walked around the corner and found Lex by the bars, holding out handfuls of hay to an animal outside that looked like a large pink pig, and was making the squeaking sounds Grant had heard. It was actually an infant triceratops about the size of a pony. The infant didn't have horns on its head yet, just a curved, bony frill behind big, soft eyes. It poked its snout through the bars toward Lex, its eyes watching her as she fed it more hay.
"That's better," Lex said. "There's plenty of hay, don't worry."
He patted the baby on the head.
"You like hay, don't you, Ralph?"
Lex turned back and saw him.
"This is Ralph," Lex said. "He's my friend. He likes hay."
Grant took a step and stopped, wincing.
"You look pretty bad," Lex said.
"I feel pretty bad."
"Tim, too. His nose is all swollen up."
"Where is Tim?"
"Peeing," she said. "Do you want to help me feed Ralph?"
The baby triceratops looked at Grant. Hay stuck out of both sides of its mouth, dropping on the floor as it chewed.
"He's a very messy eater," Lex said, "and he's very hungry."
The baby finished chewing and licked its lips. It opened its mouth, waiting for more. Grant could see the slender, sharp teeth and the beaky upper jaw like a parrot.
"Okay, just a minute," Lex said,
scooping up more straw from the concrete floor.
"Honestly, Ralph," she said, "you'd think your mother never fed you."
"Why is his name Ralph?"
"Because he looks like Ralph at school."
Grant came closer and touched the skin of the neck gently.
"It's okay. You can pet him," Lex said. "He likes it when you pet him, don't you, Ralph?"
The skin felt dry and warm, with the pebbled texture of a football. Ralph gave a little squeak as Grant petted it. Outside the bars, its thick tail swung back and forth with pleasure.
"He's pretty tame."
Ralph looked from Lex to Grant as it ate and showed no sign of fear. It reminded Grant that the dinosaurs didn't have ordinary responses to people.
"Maybe I can ride him," Lex said.
"Let's not."
"I bet he'd let me," Lex said. "It'd be fun to ride a dinosaur."
Grant looked out the bars past the animal to the open fields of the sauropod compound. It was growing lighter every minute. He should go outside, he thought, and set off one of the motion sensors on the field above. After all, it might take the people in the control room an hour to get out here to him, and he didn't like the idea that the phones were still down. He heard a deep snorting sound, like the snort of a very large horse, and suddenly the baby became agitated. It tried to pull its head back through the bars, but got caught on the edge of its frill, and it squeaked in fright. The snorting came again. It was closer this time. Ralph reared up on its hind legs, frantic to get out from between the bars. It wriggled its head back and forth, rubbing against the bars.
"Ralph, take it easy," Lex said.
"Push him out," Grant said. He reached up to Ralph's head and leaned against it, pushing the animal sideways and backward. The frill popped free, and the baby fell outside the bars, losing its balance and flopping on its side. Then the baby was covered in shadow, and a huge leg came into view, thicker than a tree trunk. The foot had 5 curved toenails like an elephant's. Ralph looked up and squeaked. A head came down into view, 6 feet long, with 3 long white horns, one above each of the large brown eyes, and a smaller horn at the tip of the nose. It was a full-grown triceratops. The big animal peered at Lex and Grant, blinking slowly, and then turned its attention to Ralph. A tongue came out and licked the baby. Ralph squeaked and rubbed up against the big leg happily.
"Is that his mom?"
Lex said. "Looks like it," Grant said.
Should we feed the mom, too? Lex said. But the big Triceratops was already nudging Ralph with her snout, pushing the baby away from the bars. Guess not. The infant turned away from the bars and walked off. From time to time, the big mother nudged her baby, guiding it away as they both walked out into the fields. Goodbye, Ralph, Lex said, waving. Tim came out of the shadows of the building. Tell you what, Grant said, I'm going up on the hill to set off the motion sensors so they'll know to come get us. You two stay here and wait for me. No, Lex said. Why? Stay here, it's safe here. You're not leaving us, she said. Right, Timmy? Right, Tim said. Okay, Grant said. They crawled through the bars, stepping outside. It was just before dawn. The air was warm and humid, the sky soft pink and purple. A white mist clung low to the ground. Some distance away they saw the mother Triceratops and the baby moving away toward a herd of large duck-billed hadrosaurs, eating foliage from trees at the edge of the lagoon. Some of the hadrosaurs stood knee-deep in the water. They drank, lowering their flat heads, meeting their own reflections in the still water. Then they looked up again, their heads swiveling. At the water's edge, one of the babies ventured out, squeaked, and scrambled back while the adults watched indulgently. Farther south, other hadrosaurs were eating the lower vegetation. Sometimes they reared up on their hind legs, resting their forelegs on the tree trunks so they could reach the leaves on higher branches. And in the far distance, a giant apatosaur stood above the trees, the tiny head swiveling on the long neck. The scene was so peaceful, Grant found it hard to imagine any danger. Yow! Lex shouted, ducking. 2 giant red dragonflies with 6-foot wingspans hummed past them. What was that? Dragonflies, he said. The Jurassic was a time of huge insects. Do they bite? Lex said. I don't think so, Grant said. Tim held out his hand. One of the dragonflies lighted on it. He could feel the weight of the huge insect. He's going to bite you, Lex warned. But the dragonfly just slowly flapped its red-veined, transparent wings, and then, when Tim moved his arm, flew off again. Which way do we go? Lex said. There. They started walking across the field. They reached a black box mounted on a heavy metal tripod, the first of the motion sensors. Grant stopped and waved his hand in front of it, back and forth. But nothing happened. If the phones didn't work, perhaps the sensors didn't work either. We'll try another one, he said, pointing across the field. Somewhere in the distance they heard the roar of a large animal. Ah, hell, Arnold said. I just can't find it. He sipped coffee and stared, bleary-eyed, at the screens. He had taken all the video monitors offline. In the control room, he was searching the computer code. He was exhausted. He'd been working for 12 straight hours. He turned to Wu, who had come up from the lab. Find what? The phones are still out. I can't get them back on. I think Nedry did something to the phones. Wu lifted one phone, heard hissing. Sounds like a modem. But it's not, Arnold said, because I went down into the basement and shut off all the modems. What you're hearing is just white noise that sounds like a modem transmitting. So the phone lines are jammed? Basically, yes. Nedry jammed them very well. He's inserted some kind of a lockout into the program code, and now I can't find it, because I gave that restore command which erased part of the program listings. But apparently the command to shut off the phones is still resident in the computer memory. Wu shrugged. So? Just reset, shut the system down, and you'll clear memory. I've never done it before, Arnold said, and I'm reluctant to do it. Maybe all the systems will come back on startup, but maybe they won't. I'm not a computer expert, and neither are you. Not really. And without an open phone line, we can't talk to anybody who is. If the command is RAM resident, it won't show up in the code. You can do a RAM dump and search that, but you don't know what you're searching for. I think all you can do is reset. Gennaro stormed in. We still don't have any telephones. Working on it. You've been working on it since midnight, and Malkin is worse. He needs medical attention. It means I'll have to shut down, Arnold said. I can't be sure everything will come back on. Gennaro said, Look, there's a sick man over in that lodge. He needs a doctor, or he'll die. You can't call for a doctor unless you have a phone. 4 people have probably died already. Now shut down and get the phones working. Arnold hesitated. Well, Gennaro said, well, it's just... the safety systems don't allow the computer to be shut down, and then turn the goddamn safety systems off. Can't you get it through your head that he's going to die unless he gets help? "Okay," Arnold said. He got up and went to the main panel. He opened the doors and uncovered the metal swing latches over the safety switches. He popped them off, one after another. "You asked for it," Arnold said, "and you got it." He threw the master switch. The control room was dark. All the monitors were black. The three men stood there in the dark. "How long do we have to wait?" Gennaro said. 30 seconds, Arnold said. "P.U., Lex said as they crossed the field. "What?" Grant said. "That smell," Lex said. "It stinks like rotten garbage." Grant hesitated. He stared across the field toward the distant trees, looking for movement. He saw nothing. There was hardly a breeze to stir the branches. It was peaceful and silent in the early morning. "I think it's your imagination," he said. "Is not." Then he heard the honking sound. It came from the herd of duck-billed hadrosaurs behind them, first one animal, then another and another, until the whole herd had taken up the honking cry. The duckbills were agitated, twisting and turning, hurrying out of the water, circling the young ones to protect them. They smell it too, Grant thought. With a roar, the tyrannosaur burst from the trees 50 yards away near the lagoon. It rushed out across the open field with huge strides. It ignored them, heading toward the herd of hadrosaurs. "I told you," Lex screamed. "Nobody listens to me." In the distance, the duckbills were honking and starting to run. Grant could feel the earth shake beneath his feet. "Come on, kids!" He grabbed Lex, lifting her bodily off the ground, and ran with Tim through the grass. He had glimpses of the tyrannosaur down by the lagoon, lunging at the hadrosaurs, which swung their big tails in defense and honked loudly and continuously. He heard the crashing of foliage and trees, and when he looked over again, the duckbills were charging. In the darkened control room, Arnold checked his watch. 30 seconds. The memory should be cleared by now. He pushed the main power switch back on. Nothing happened. Arnold's stomach heaved. He pushed the switch off, then on again. Still nothing happened. He felt sweat on his brow. "What's wrong?" Gennaro said. "Oh, hell," Arnold said. Then he remembered you had to turn the safety switches back on before you restarted the power. He flipped on the 3 safeties and covered them again with the latch covers. Then he held his breath and turned the main power switch. The room lights came on. The computer beeped. The screens hummed. "Thank God," Arnold said. He hurried to the main monitor. Below the heading Jurassic Park System Startup, there were rows of labels on the screen. Gennaro reached for the phone, but it was dead. No static hissing this time, just nothing at all. "What's this?" "Give me a second," Arnold said. "After a reset, all the system modules have to be brought online manually." Quickly, he went back to work. "Why manually?" Gennaro said. "Will you just let me work, for Christ's sake?" Wu said, "The system is not intended to ever shut down, so if it does shut down, it assumes that there is a problem somewhere. It requires you to start up everything manually. Otherwise, if there were a short somewhere, the system would start up, short out, start up again, short out again, in an endless cycle." "Okay," Arnold said, "we're going." Gennaro picked up the phone and started to dial when he suddenly stopped. "Jesus, look at that," he said. He pointed to one of the video monitors, but Arnold wasn't listening. He was staring at the map, where a tight cluster of dots by the lagoon had started to move in a coordinated way, moving fast, in a kind of swirl. "What's happening?" Gennaro said. "The duckbills," Arnold said tonelessly. "They've stampeded." The duckbills charged with surprising speed, their enormous bodies in a tight cluster, honking and roaring, the infants squealing and trying to stay out from underfoot. The herd raised a great cloud of yellow dust. Grant couldn't see the tyrannosaur. The duckbills were running right toward them. Still carrying Lex, he ran, with Tim, toward a rocky outcrop with a stand of big conifers. They ran hard, feeling the ground shake beneath their feet. The sound of the approaching herd was deafening, like the sound of jets at an airport. It filled the air and hurt their ears. Lex was shouting something, but he couldn't hear what she was saying, and as they scrambled onto the rocks, the herd closed in around them. Grant saw the immense legs of the first hadrosaurs that charged past, each animal weighing 5 tons, and then they were enveloped in a cloud so dense he could see nothing at all. He had the impression of huge bodies, giant limbs, bellowing cries of pain as the animals wheeled and circled. One duckbill struck a boulder, and it rolled past them, out into the field beyond. In the dense cloud of dust, they could see almost nothing beyond the rocks. They clung to the boulders, listening to the screams and honks, the menacing roar of the tyrannosaur. Lex dug her fingers into Grant's shoulder. Another hadrosaur slammed its big tail against the rocks, leaving a splash of hot blood. Grant waited until the sounds of the fighting had moved off to the left, and then he pushed the kids to start climbing the largest tree. They climbed swiftly, feeling for the branches as the animals stampeded all around them in the dust. They went up 20 feet, and then Lex clutched at Grant and refused to go farther. Tim was tired, too, and Grant thought they were high enough. Through the dust, they could see the broad backs of the animals below as they wheeled and honked. Grant propped himself against the coarse bark of the trunk, coughed in the dust, closed his eyes, and waited. Arnold adjusted the camera as the herd moved away. The dust slowly cleared. He saw that the hadrosaurs had scattered, and the tyrannosaur had stopped running, which could only mean it had made a kill. The tyrannosaur was now near the lagoon. Arnold looked at the video monitor and said, "Better get Muldoon to go out there and see how bad it is." "I'll get him," Gennaro said, and left the room. The park. A faint crackling sound, like a fire in a fireplace. Something warm and wet tickled Grant's ankle. He opened his eyes and saw an enormous beige head. The head tapered to a flat mouth, shaped like the bill of a duck. The eyes, protruding above the flat duck bill, were gentle and soft like a cow's. The duck mouth opened and chewed branches on the limb where Grant was sitting. He saw large, flat teeth in the cheek. The warm lips touched his ankle again as the animal chewed. A duck-billed hadrosaur. He was astonished to see it up close. Not that he was afraid. All the species of duck-billed dinosaurs were herbivorous, and this one acted exactly like a cow. Even though it was huge, its manner was so calm and peaceful, Grant didn't feel threatened. He stayed where he was on the branch, careful not to move, and watched as it ate. The reason Grant was astonished was that he had a proprietary feeling about this animal. It was probably a maiasaur from the late Cretaceous in Montana. With John Horner, Grant had been the first to describe the species. Maiasaurs had an upcurved lip, which gave them the appearance of smiling. The name meant good mother lizard. Maiasaurs were thought to protect their eggs until the babies were born and could take care of themselves. Grant heard an insistent chirping, and the big head swung down. He moved just enough to see the baby hadrosaur scampering around the feet of the adult. The baby was dark beige with black spots. The adult bent her head low to the ground and waited, unmoving, while the baby stood up on its hind legs, resting its front legs on the mother's jaw, and ate the branches that protruded from the side of the mother's mouth. The mother waited patiently until the baby had finished eating and dropped back down to all fours again. Then the big head came back up toward Grant. The hadrosaur continued to eat, just a few feet from him. Grant looked at the two elongated air holes on top of the flat upper bill. Apparently the dinosaur couldn't smell Grant. And even though the left eye was looking right at him, for some reason the hadrosaur didn't react to him. He remembered how the tyrannosaur had failed to see him the previous night. Grant decided on an experiment. He coughed. Instantly the hadrosaur froze, the big head suddenly still, the jaws no longer chewing. Only the eye moved, looking for the source of the sound. Then, after a moment, when there seemed to be no danger, the animal resumed chewing. Amazing, Grant thought. Sitting in his arms, Lex opened her eyes and said, "Hey, what's that?" The hadrosaur trumpeted in alarm, a loud, resonant honk that so startled Lex that she nearly fell out of the tree. The hadrosaur pulled its head away from the branch and trumpeted again. "Don't make her mad," Tim said from the branch above. The baby chirped and scurried beneath the mother's legs as the hadrosaur stepped away from the tree. The mother cocked her head and peered inquisitively at the branch where Grant and Lex were sitting. With its upturned, smiling lips, the dinosaur had a comical appearance. "Is it dumb?" Lex said. "No," Grant said. "You just surprised her." "Well," Lex said, "is she going to let us get down or what?" The hadrosaur had backed 10 feet away from the tree. She honked again. Grant had the impression she was trying to frighten them away. But the dinosaur didn't really seem to know what to do. She acted confused and uneasy. They waited in silence, and after a minute the hadrosaur approached the branch again, jaws moving in anticipation. She was clearly going to resume eating. "Forget it," Lex said. "I'm not staying here." She started to climb down the branches. At her movement, the hadrosaur trumpeted in fresh alarm. Grant was amazed. He thought, it really can't see us when we don't move. And after a minute, it literally forgets that we're here. This was just like the tyrannosaur, another classic example of an amphibian visual cortex. Studies of frogs had shown that amphibians only saw moving things like insects. If something didn't move, they literally didn't see it. The same thing seemed to be true of dinosaurs. In any case, the Maiasaur now seemed to find these strange creatures climbing down the tree too upsetting. With a final honk, she nudged her baby and lumbered slowly away. She paused once and looked back at them, then continued on. They reached the ground. Lex shook herself off. Both children were covered in a layer of fine dust. All around them the grass had been flattened. There were streaks of blood and a sour smell. Grant looked at his watch. "We better get going, kids," he said. "Not me," Lex said. "I'm not walking out there any more." "We have to." "Why?" "Because," Grant said, "we have to tell them about the boat. Since they can't see us on the motion sensors, we have to go all the way back ourselves. It's the only way." "Why can't we take the raft?" Tim said. "What raft?" Tim pointed to the low concrete maintenance building with the bars where they had spent the night. It was 20 yards away across the field. "I saw a raft back there," he said. Grant immediately understood the advantages. It was now 7 o'clock in the morning. They had at least 8 miles to go. If they could take a raft along the river, they would make much faster progress than going overland. "Let's do it," Grant said. Arnold punched the visual search mode and watched as the monitors began to scan throughout the park, the images changing every 2 seconds. It was tiring to watch, but it was the fastest way to find Nedry's jeep, and Muldoon had been adamant about that. He'd gone out with Gennaro to look at the stampede, but now that it was daylight, he wanted the car found. He wanted the weapons. His intercom clicked. "Mr. Arnold, may I have a word with you, please?" It was Hammond. He sounded like the voice of God. "You want to come here, Mr. Hammond?" "No, Mr. Arnold," Hammond said. "Come to me. I'm in the genetics lab with Dr. Wu. We'll be waiting for you." Arnold sighed and stepped away from the screens. Grant stumbled deep in the gloomy recesses of the building. He pushed past 5-gallon containers of herbicide, tree-pruning equipment, spare tires for a jeep, coils of cyclone fencing, 100-pound fertilizer bags, stacks of brown ceramic insulators, empty motor oil cans, work lights, and cables. "I don't see any raft." "Keep going." Bags of cement, lengths of copper pipe, green mesh, and 2 plastic oars hung on clips on the concrete wall. "Okay," he said, "but where's the raft?" "It must be here somewhere," Tim said. "You never saw a raft?" "No, I just assumed it was here." Poking among the junk, Grant found no raft. But he did find a set of plans rolled up and speckled with mold from humidity, stuck back in a metal cabinet on the wall. He spread the plans on the floor, brushing away a big spider. He looked at them for a long time. "I'm hungry." "Just a minute." They were detailed topographical charts for the main area of the island where they now were. According to this, the lagoon narrowed into the river they had seen earlier, which twisted northward, right through the aviary, and on to within a half-mile of the visitor lodge. He flipped back through the pages. How to get to the lagoon? According to the plans, there should be a door at the back of the building they were in. Grant looked up and saw it, recessed back in the concrete wall. The door was wide enough for a car. Opening it, he saw a paved road running straight down toward the lagoon. The road was dug below ground level, so it couldn't be seen from above. Must be another service road. And it led to a dock at the edge of the lagoon. And clearly stenciled on the dock was raft storage. "Hey," Tim said, "look at this." He held out a metal case to Grant. Opening it, Grant found a compressed air pistol and a cloth belt that held darts. There were 6 darts in all, each as thick as his finger, labeled Moro 709. "Good work, Tim." He slung the belt around his shoulder and stuck the gun in his trousers. "Is it a tranquilizer gun?" "I'd say so." "What about the boat?" Lex said. "I think it's on the dock," Grant said. They started down the road. Grant carried the oars on his shoulder. "I hope it's a big raft," Lex said, "because I can't swim." "Don't worry," he said. "Maybe we can catch some fish," she said. They walked down the road with a sloping embankment rising up on both sides of them. They heard a deep, rhythmic snorting sound, but Grant could not see where it was coming from. "Are you sure there's a raft down here?" Lex said, wrinkling her nose. "Probably," Grant said. The rhythmic snorting became louder as they walked, but they also heard a steady droning, buzzing sound. When they reached the end of the road, at the edge of the small concrete dock, Grant froze in shock. The Tyrannosaur was right there. It was sitting upright in the shade of a tree, its hind legs stretched out in front. Its eyes were open, but it was not moving, except for its head, which lifted and fell gently with each snorting sound. The buzzing came from the clouds of flies that surrounded it, crawling over its face and slack jaws, its bloody fangs, and the red haunch of a killed hadrosaur that lay on its side behind the tyrannosaur. The tyrannosaur was only 20 yards away. Grant felt sure it must have seen him, but the big animal did not respond. It just sat there. It took him a moment to realize. The tyrannosaur was asleep, sitting up but asleep. He signaled to Tim and Lex to stay where they were. Grant walked slowly forward onto the dock. In full view of the tyrannosaur, the big animal continued to sleep, snoring softly. Near the end of the dock, a wooden shed was painted green to blend with the foliage. Grant quietly unlatched the door and looked inside. He saw a half-dozen orange life vests hanging on the wall, several rolls of wire mesh fencing, some coils of rope, and 2 big rubber cubes sitting on the floor. The cubes were strapped tight with flat rubber belts. Rafts. He looked back at Lex. She mouthed, "No boat." He nodded, "Yes." The tyrannosaur raised its forelimb to swipe at the flies buzzing around its snout, but otherwise it did not move. Grant pulled one of the cubes out onto the dock. It was surprisingly heavy. He freed the straps, found the inflation cylinder. With a loud hiss, the rubber began to expand, and then with a hiss whap, it popped fully open on the dock. The sound was fearfully loud in their ears. Grant turned, stared up at the dinosaur. The tyrannosaur grunted and snorted. It began to move. Grant braced himself to run, but the animal shifted its ponderous bulk, and then it settled back against the tree trunk and gave a long, growling belch. Lex looked disgusted, waving her hand in front of her face. Grant was soaked in sweat from the tension. He dragged the rubber raft across the dock. It flopped into the water with a loud splash. The dinosaur continued to sleep. Grant tied the boat up to the dock and returned to the shed to take out 2 life preservers. He put these in the boat, and then waved for the kids to come out onto the dock. Pale with fear, Lex waved back, "No." He gestured, "Yes." The tyrannosaur continued to sleep. Grant stabbed in the air with an emphatic finger. Lex came silently, and he gestured for her to get into the raft. Then Tim got in, and they both put on their life vests. Grant got in and pushed off. The raft drifted silently out into the lagoon. Grant picked up his paddles and fitted them into the oarlocks. They moved farther from the dock. Lex sat back and sighed loudly with relief. Then she looked stricken and put her hand over her mouth. Her body shook with muffled sounds. She was suppressing a cough. She always coughed at the wrong times. "Lex!" Tim whispered fiercely, looking back toward the shore. She shook her head miserably and pointed to her throat. He knew what she meant, a tickle in her throat. What she needed was a drink of water. Grant was rowing, and Tim leaned over the side of the raft and scooped his hand in the lagoon, holding his cupped hand toward her. Lex coughed loudly, explosively. In Tim's ears, the sound echoed across the water like a gunshot. The tyrannosaur yawned lazily and scratched behind its ear with its hind foot, just like a dog. It yawned again. It was groggy after its big meal, and it woke up slowly. On the boat, Lex was making little gargling sounds. "Lex, shut up," Tim said. "I can't help it," she whispered, and then she coughed again. Grant rowed hard, moving the raft powerfully into the center of the lagoon. On the shore, the tyrannosaur stumbled to its feet. "I couldn't help it, Timmy," Lex shrieked miserably. "I couldn't help it." "Shh!" Grant was rowing as fast as he could. "Anyway, it doesn't matter," she said. "We're far enough away. He can't swim." "Of course he can swim, you little idiot," Tim shouted at her. On the shore, the tyrannosaur stepped off the dock and plunged into the water. It moved strongly into the lagoon after them. "Well, how should I know?" she said. "Everybody knows tyrannosaurs can swim. It's in all the books. Anyway, all reptiles can swim. Snakes can. Of course snakes can, you idiot." "Settle down," Grant said. "Hold on to something." Grant was watching the tyrannosaur, noticing how the animal swam. The tyrannosaur was now chest-deep in the water, but it could hold its big head high above the surface. Then Grant realized the animal wasn't swimming. It was walking, because moments later only the very top of the head, the eyes and nostrils, protruded above the surface. By then it looked like a crocodile, and it swam like a crocodile, swinging its big tail back and forth, so the water churned behind it. Behind the head, Grant saw the hump of the back and the ridges along the length of tail as it occasionally broke the surface. Exactly like a crocodile, he thought unhappily. The biggest crocodile in the world. "I'm sorry, Dr. Grant," Lex wailed. "I didn't mean it." Grant glanced over his shoulder. The lagoon was no more than 100 yards wide here, and they'd almost reached the center. If he continued, the water would become shallow again. The Tyrannosaur would be able to walk again, and he would move faster in shallow water. Grant swung the boat around and began to row north. "What are you doing?" The Tyrannosaur was now just a few yards away. Grant could hear its sharp, snorting breaths as it came closer. Grant looked at the paddles in his hands, but they were light plastic, not weapons at all. The Tyrannosaur threw its head back and opened its jaws wide, showing rows of curved teeth, and then, in a great muscular spasm, lunged forward to the raft, just missing the rubber gunnel, the huge skull slapping down, the raft rocking away on the crest of the splash. The Tyrannosaur sank below the surface, leaving gurgling bubbles. The lagoon was still. Lex gripped the gunnel handles and looked back. "Did he drown?" "No," Grant said. He saw bubbles, then a faint ripple along the surface, coming toward the boat. "Hang on!" he shouted, as the head bucked up beneath the rubber, bending the boat and lifting it into the air, spinning them crazily before it splashed down again. "Do something!" Alexis screamed. "Do something!" Grant pulled the air pistol out of his belt. It looked pitifully small in his hands, but there was the chance that if he shot the animal in a sensitive spot, in the eye or the nose, the Tyrannosaur surface beside the boat opened its jaws and roared. Grant aimed and fired. The dart flashed in the light and smacked into the cheek. The Tyrannosaur shook its head and roared again, and suddenly they heard an answering roar floating across the water toward them. Looking back, Grant saw the juvenile T-Rex on the shore, crouched over the killed sauropod, claiming the kill as its own. The juvenile slashed at the carcass, then raised its head high and bellowed. The big Tyrannosaur saw it too, and the response was immediate. It turned back to protect its kill, swimming strongly toward the shore. "He's going away!" Lex squealed, clapping her hands. "He's going away! Na, 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 stupid dinosaur!" From the shore, the juvenile roared defiantly. Enraged, the big Tyrannosaur burst from the lagoon at full speed, water streaming from its enormous body as it raced up the hill past the dock. The juvenile ducked its head and fled, its jaws still filled with ragged flesh. The big Tyrannosaur chased it, racing past the dead sauropod, disappearing over the hill. They heard its final threatening bellow, and then the raft moved to the north, around a bend in the lagoon, to the river. Exhausted from rowing, Grant collapsed back, his chest heaving. He couldn't catch his breath. He lay gasping in the raft. "Are you okay, Dr. Grant?" Lex asked. "From now on, will you just do what I tell you?" "Okay," she sighed, as if he had just made the most unreasonable demand in the world. She trailed her arm in the water for a while. "You stopped rowing," she said. "I'm tired," Grant said. "Then how come we're still moving?" Grant sat up. She was right. The raft drifted steadily north. There must be a current. The current was carrying them north, toward the hotel. He looked at his watch, and was astonished to see it was 15 minutes past 7. Only 15 minutes had passed since he had last looked at his watch. It seemed like 2 hours. Grant lay back against the rubber gunnels, closed his eyes, and slept. 5th iteration. Flaws in the system will now become severe. Ian Malcolm. Search. Gennaro sat in the jeep and listened to the buzzing of the flies, and stared at the distant palm trees wavering in the heat. He was astonished by what looked like a battleground. The grass was trampled flat for 100 yards in every direction. One big palm tree was uprooted from the ground. There were great washes of blood in the grass, and on the rocky outcropping to their right. Sitting beside him, Muldoon said, "No doubt about it. Rexy's been among the hadrosaurs." He took another drink of whiskey and capped the bottle. "Damn lot of flies," he said. They waited and watched. Gennaro drummed his fingers on the dashboard. "What are we waiting for?" Muldoon didn't answer immediately. "The Rex is out there somewhere," he said, squinting at the landscape in the morning sun. "And we don't have any weapons worth a damn." "We're in a jeep." "Oh, we can outrun the jeep, Mr. Gennaro," Muldoon said, shaking his head. "Once we leave this road and go onto open terrain, the best we can do in a four-wheel drive is 30-40 miles an hour. He'll run us right down, no problem for him." Muldoon sighed. "I don't see much moving out there now. You ready to live dangerously?" "Sure," Gennaro said. Muldoon started the engine, and at the sudden sound, 2 small Ophnelians leapt up from the matted grass directly ahead. Muldoon put the car in gear. He drove in a wide circle around the trampled site, and then moved inward, driving in decreasing concentric circles until he finally came to the place in the field where the little Ophnelians had been. Then he got out and walked forward in the grass, away from the jeep. He stopped as a dense cloud of flies lifted into the air. "What is it?" Gennaro called. "Bring the radio," Muldoon said. Gennaro climbed out of the jeep and hurried forward. Even from a distance he could smell the sour-sweet odor of early decay. He saw a dark shape in the grass, crusted with blood, legs askew. "Young hadrosaur," Muldoon said, staring down at the carcass. "The whole herd stampeded, and the young one got separated, and the T-Rex brought it down." "How do you know?" Gennaro said. The flesh was ragged from many bites. "You can tell from the excreta," Muldoon said. "See those chalky white bits there in the grass? That's hadrospore. Uric acid makes it white. But you look there," he pointed to a large mound rising knee-high in the grass. "That's tyrannosaur spore." "How do you know the tyrannosaur didn't come later?" "The bite pattern," Muldoon said. "See those little ones there?" He pointed along the belly. "Those are from the Authis. Those bites haven't bled. They're post-mortem from scavengers. Authis did that. But the hadro was brought down by a bite on the neck. You see the big slash there, above the shoulder blades? That's the T-Rex, no question." Gennaro bent over the carcass, staring at the awkward, trampled limbs with a sense of unreality. Beside him, Muldoon flicked on his radio. "Control?" "Yes," John Arnold said over the radio. "We got another hadro dead. Juvenile." Muldoon bent down among the flies and checked the skin on the sole of the right foot. A number was tattooed there. "Specimen is number HD/09. The radio crackled. "I've got something for you," Arnold said. "Oh? What's that?" "I found Nedry." The jeep burst through the line of palm trees along the east road and came out into a narrower service road leading toward the Jungle River. It was hot in this area of the park, the jungle close and fetid around them. Muldoon was fiddling with a computer monitor in the jeep, which now showed a map of the resort with overlaid grid lines. "They found him up on remote video," he said. "Sector 1104 is just ahead." Farther up the road, Gennaro saw a concrete barrier, and the jeep parked alongside it. "He must have taken the wrong turn off," Muldoon said. "The little bastard." "What did he take?" Gennaro asked. "Who says 15 embryos? Know what that's worth?" Gennaro shook his head. "Somewhere between 2 and 10 million, Muldoon said. He shook his head. "Big stakes." As they came closer, Gennaro saw the body lying beside the car. The body was indistinct and green, but then green shapes scattered away as the jeep pulled to a stop. "Compys," Muldoon said. "The Compys found him." A dozen Procompsognathids, delicate little predators no larger than ducks, stood at the edge of the jungle, chittering excitedly as the men climbed out of the car. Dennis Nedry lay on his back, the chubby boyish face now red and bloated. Flies buzzed around the gaping mouth and thick tongue. His body was mangled, the intestines torn open, one leg chewed through. Gennaro turned away quickly to look at the little Compys which squatted on their hind legs a short distance away and watched the men curiously. The little dinosaurs had 5-fingered hands, he noticed. They wiped their faces and chins, giving them an eerily human quality, which, "I'll be damned," Muldoon said. "Wasn't the Compys." "What?" Muldoon was shaking his head. "See these blotches? On his shirt and face? Smell that sweet smell like old dried vomit?" Gennaro rolled his eyes. He smelled it. "That's Dillo saliva," Muldoon said. "Spit from the Dilophosaurs. You see the damage on the corneas, all that redness? In the eyes, it's painful, but not fatal. You've got about 2 hours to wash it out with the antivenin. We keep it all around the park, just in case. Not that it mattered to this bastard. They blinded him, then ripped him down the middle. Not a nice way to go. Maybe there's justice in the world after all." The Procompsognathids squeaked and hopped up and down as Muldoon opened the back door and took out gray metal tubing in a stainless steel case. "It's all still there," he said. He handed 2 dark cylinders to Gennaro. "What are these?" Gennaro said. "Just what they look like," Muldoon said. "Rockets." As Gennaro backed away, he said, "Watch it. You don't want to step in something." Gennaro stepped carefully over Nedry's body. Muldoon carried the tubing to the other jeep and placed it in the back. He climbed behind the wheel. "Let's go." "What about him?" Gennaro said, pointing to the body. "What about him?" Muldoon said. "We've got things to do." He put the car in gear. Looking back, Gennaro saw the compys resume their feeding. One jumped up and squatted on Nedry's open mouth as it nibbled the flesh of his nose.